At 6:23 a.m. on April 24, 1945, 12-year-old Hans Müller crouched behind the shattered remains of a bakery in Berlin. A Soviet T-34 tank was grinding through the rubble toward his position. 8 kilometers per hour. Unstoppable. He'd been in the Hitler Youth for 18 months. He'd been given a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon 9 hours ago. He'd been shown how to use it exactly once. By a 16-year-old who'd never actually fired one at a real tank. The Panzerfaust weighed 11 pounds. Hans weighed 82. His helmet kept sliding down over his eyes. His hands shook so badly he had to grip the weapon with both arms wrapped around it. In his pocket was a photograph of his mother. On his wrist was his father's watch, stopped at 2:47 a.m. when the Soviet artillery barrage started. The tank was 200 meters away. Then 150. Hans was supposed to wait until it was 30 meters away. Maximum effective range. 1 shot. The problem? Hans had never killed anything before. Not even a rabbit. Now he was supposed to destroy a 26-ton tank. This is the story of how a 12-year-old boy from Berlin ended up holding a weapon he didn't know how to use, in a war he didn't understand, fighting for a regime that was about to send him to die for nothing. Hans Müller was born on March 3, 1933. The same year Hitler came to power. His father, Otto, was a tram conductor. His mother, Greta, worked at a brewery. They lived in a 2-room apartment in Wedding, a working-class district in northern Berlin. Hans was an ordinary kid. He collected stamps. He was terrible at mathematics but good at drawing. His best friend was Peter Hoffmann, who lived 3 floors down. They'd play football in the street until dark, using rolled-up newspaper as a ball because real footballs were already being rationed. On October 15, 1943, everything changed in 90 seconds. Hans was walking home from school. The air raid sirens started at 2:17 p.m. The British Lancaster bombers came in at 2:23 p.m. Hans made it to the shelter with maybe 20 seconds to spare. The bombs fell for 18 minutes. When you're underground, you can't hear individual explosions. It's just continuous thunder. Like the world is being torn apart over your head. When the all-clear sounded, Hans climbed out to find that his street was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The building where he'd lived his entire life was now a crater filled with broken brick and twisted metal. His mother was at work when the bombs fell. She survived. His father had been on shift, driving tramline 50. The tram depot took a direct hit. 16 conductors and drivers died. Otto Müller was one of them. They buried him on October 19 in a mass grave because individual graves were no longer practical. Hans stood in the rain with his mother and didn't cry. Because crying felt too small for what had happened. 3 weeks later, Hans joined the Hitler Youth. He was 10 years old. Here's what nobody talks about. For a 10-year-old boy who'd just lost his father and his home, the Hitler Youth felt like the only stable thing left in the world. They had uniforms that fit. They had hot meals. They had adults who told you exactly what to do so you didn't have to think about the fact that your entire life had been blown to pieces. Hans didn't join because he believed in Nazi ideology. He joined because he was a scared kid who needed something to hold on to. And the Hitler Youth was there. The early months were almost normal. Camping trips. Sports competitions. Singing songs around campfires. Learning Morse code and first aid and map reading. For boys who'd grown up with nothing, it felt like an adventure. Peter Hoffmann joined 2 days after Hans. They stayed together through training. By early 1944, the program changed. The camping trips became tactical training. The sports became endurance marches with full packs. The first aid training became battlefield medicine. They learned to fire rifles. To identify Allied aircraft. To dig defensive positions in frozen ground. Nobody used the word soldier. But that's what they were being turned into. There were 3 names Hans would carry for the rest of his life. Peter Hoffmann. 12 years old. Hans's best friend since childhood. Optimistic in a way that seemed impossible. He'd share his rations. He'd make jokes when everyone else was too tired to talk. Klaus Weber. 17 years old. Their unit leader. Had been in the Hitler Youth since he was 10. Believed everything he'd been taught about duty and sacrifice. But he wasn't cruel. He tried to prepare the boys for what was coming. Ernst Vogel. 13 years old. His entire family had been killed in a bombing raid. Quiet. Angry. Desperate to prove himself. Remember these names. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. 2.2 million Soviet troops crashed through German defenses in Poland. By January 31, Soviet forces had crossed the Oder River, the last major natural barrier before Berlin. They were 70 kilometers from the capital. Hans learned about it the way everyone did. From the absence of news. The radio stopped giving specific locations of the fighting. The newspapers printed vague assurances about strategic withdrawals. But when you saw columns of refugees streaming through Berlin's streets, when you heard the distant thunder of artillery at night, when Wehrmacht soldiers started appearing with that 1,000-yard stare that meant they'd seen something that broke them, you knew. On February 25, 1945, Hans's Hitler Youth unit received new orders. They were being converted to combat auxiliary status. Translation: they were going to fight. Klaus Weber gathered them in a school basement that now served as their barracks. 40 boys. Ages 10 to 16. Klaus was 17. Which made him the adult in the room. Higher command has determined that Berlin will be defended house by house, street by street, Klaus said. His voice didn't shake. But his hands did. We've been assigned to the defensive sector in Prenzlauer Berg. We'll be receiving weapons and tactical assignments in the coming weeks. Someone in the back started crying. Nobody said anything about it. Klaus continued. I know this isn't what you expected. I know you're scared. I am too. But Germany needs us. The Führer needs us. This is our chance to show. We're children. Ernst Vogel stood up. We're fucking children, Klaus. We don't know how to fight a war. Klaus didn't punish him for the interruption. He just looked at Ernst for a long moment. I know, Klaus said quietly. But nobody's asking. The weapons arrived on March 3, 1945. Hans's 12th birthday. 50 Mauser rifles. Decades old. Some with rust visible on the barrels. 20 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. Single shot. Disposable. 10 Stitt grenades. 1 machine gun with 500 rounds and nobody who actually knew how to maintain it. They got 3 days of training. 3 days to learn things that professional soldiers spent months mastering. Hans fired his rifle twice during training. The recoil knocked him backward the first time. His shoulder was bruised purple from just 2 shots. The rifle was too long for him to hold properly. He had to brace it against rubble to aim. The Panzerfaust training was even worse. Klaus demonstrated the weapon once. How to remove the safety. How to aim. How to account for the backblast that would kill anyone standing behind you. Then each boy got to hold it. Not fire it. Just hold it. Live ammunition was too precious to waste on target practice. Aim for the tracks or the lower hull, Klaus explained. Maximum effective range is 30 meters. Minimum arming distance is 5 meters. If you're closer than that, It won't detonate and you'll just make the tank angry. Wait until you can see the commander's face. Then fire. One shot. Then run, because if you miss, they'll know where you are. Peter raised his hand. What if we can't run fast enough? Klaus didn't answer that question. Soviet forces reached the outer suburbs of Berlin on March 16, 1945. Artillery fire became constant. Not occasional thunder in the distance, but continuous rolling barges that shook dust from ruined buildings and made sleep impossible. On March 17 at 4:30 a.m., Hans's unit was ordered to a defensive position. A Soviet probing attack was expected. They were supposed to observe and report. Not engage. They marched through dark streets. 40 boys with rifles they barely knew how to use. Following Klaus Weber, who was doing his best to project confidence he didn't feel. The Soviets came at 5:47 a.m. Not a probe. A full assault. 3 T-34 tanks and roughly 60 infantry. Hans's first experience of combat lasted 11 minutes. He spent most of it pressed flat against the ground behind a destroyed tramcar. Hands over his ears. Unable to process the volume of the violence. Klaus tried to organize a withdrawal. He stood up to signal the fallback position. A Soviet sniper, somewhere in the rubble, shot him through the chest. 5:58 a.m. Klaus died at 6:04 a.m., bleeding out on Danziger Strasse while boys who'd trusted him to keep them safe tried to stop the bleeding with field dressings they didn't know how to apply properly. His last words were, "I'm sorry." Hans and Peter dragged his body back to their lines. Ernst Vogel stayed behind, firing his rifle until he ran out of ammunition. Then throwing grenades until he ran out of those too. The Soviets didn't kill him. They captured him. Realized he was 13. Sent him to a POW collection point for children. Hans wouldn't learn Ernst survived until 1947. Klaus Weber was buried in the courtyard of the school. No ceremony. No marker. Just a body wrapped in a blanket, buried shallow because the ground was still frozen. He was 17 years old. He'd been responsible for 40 boys. Now he was dead. And those boys had no leader, no training, and no idea what they were supposed to do. Hans woke up at 6 a.m. on April 24, 1945, in the basement of the school. 23 boys left from the original 40. Klaus was dead. Ernst was missing. Peter was sleeping next to him, curled up against the cold. There was no breakfast. There hadn't been real food in 3 days. Just water from a broken pipe and some moldy bread someone found in a bombed-out bakery. The artillery started at 6:15 a.m. Heavier than usual. The building shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. At 6:20 a.m., an SS officer appeared. He was maybe 30. Hollow-eyed. Wearing a uniform that was too clean for someone who'd actually been fighting. He looked at the boys like they were ammunition to be expended. Soviet forces are advancing on this sector. You will defend the intersection at Skönhauser Allee and Starterter Strasse. Anti-tank teams to the front. Riflemen provide cover. Hold the position until relieved. One of the younger boys raised his hand. When will we be relieved? The SS officer looked at him. When Berlin is saved or when you're dead. Whichever comes first. He left. Nobody spoke for a long moment. We could run, Peter said quietly. We could go west. Try to reach the American lines. Hans had thought about it. They all had. But running meant being shot as deserters. And where would you go? The city was surrounded. The Americans were still 80 kilometers away. So they picked up their weapons. And they marched to the intersection. Hans took position behind the ruined bakery with Peter and 2 other boys. They had 1 Panzerfaust between them. 30 rounds of rifle ammunition total. The street in front of them had been one of Berlin's major commercial boulevards. Now it was a canyon of shattered buildings and burned-out tram cars. You could see maybe 300 meters before the rubble and smoke obscured everything. At 6:23 a.m., the T-34 appeared. It emerged from the smoke like something from a nightmare. Massive. Unstoppable. The engine roar echoed off the broken buildings. The treads ground over rubble with a sound like bones breaking. Hans had the Panzerfaust. They'd decided he'd take the shot because Peter was shaking too badly and the other two boys were even younger. "Wait for 30 meters, Peter whispered. "You have to wait." The tank was 200 meters away. Hans lifted the Panzerfaust. It was so heavy he had to rest it on a pile of bricks. 150 meters. Hans could see the commander now. Standing in the open hatch. Scanning with binoculars. He looked tired. Maybe 25 years old. Just doing his job. Riding a tank through a destroyed city. Looking for children with weapons. 100 meters. Hans's finger touched the trigger. 50 meters. Peter was whispering something. Maybe a prayer. The tank commander was looking right at them. Reaching for his radio to call in their position. 30 meters. Hans pulled the trigger. The Panzerfaust fired with a roar and a backblast that knocked Hans backward into Peter. The rocket streaked toward the tank trailing smoke. Hans missed. Not by much. Maybe half a meter. The rocket struck the rubble next to the tank and detonated in a spray of dirt and fragmented brick. The explosion was loud enough to temporarily deafen everyone in a 20-meter radius. The tank didn't stop. The turret traversed. The main gun swung toward their position with mechanical precision. Hans could see down the barrel of the 76mm cannon from 25 meters away. The tank didn't fire. The commander was shouting something Hans couldn't hear. The tank stopped. The turret stopped traversing. For maybe 10 seconds, everything just stopped. Then the commander pulled himself out of the hatch completely and stood on the turret. He was yelling at Hans. In Russian, so Hans couldn't understand the words. But the tone was universal. It was the tone every adult uses when they're angry and disappointed and completely exasperated. It took Hans a moment to understand what was happening. The Soviet tank commander had realized he was being attacked by a child. And he decided not to kill him. The tank commander climbed down from the T-34. He was tall. Broad-shouldered. Wearing a padded tanker's jacket stained with oil and dirt. He walked toward Hans's position with his hands out. Palms open. Making it very clear he wasn't drawing a weapon. He stopped 3 meters away and looked at Hans. Really looked at him. Took in the oversized helmet. The rifle that was too big. The fact that this soldier was barely tall enough to see over the rubble he was hiding behind. The tank commander said something in Russian. Then he tried German. Accented but understandable. "How old are you?" Hans couldn't answer. His voice wouldn't work. "How old?" the Soviet soldier asked again. Quieter this time. 12, Peter answered for him. The tank commander closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. "The war is over," he said in broken German. "For you, is over. You put down gun. You go home." He turned and called out to his crew. 2 more Soviet soldiers climbed out of the tank. Young guys. Maybe 20. They looked at Hans and Peter and the other boys with expressions Hans couldn't quite read. Anger. Pity. Exhaustion. Relief. One of them offered Hans a piece of bread from his ration pack. Hans took it. His hands were still shaking so badly he dropped it twice. You go that way. The tank commander pointed west. American lines, 2 days walking maybe. You do not fight. You are children. He paused. Fuck this war. You go home. Then he climbed back on his tank and they drove past, leaving the boys standing in the rubble, alive when they should have been dead. Because a Soviet tank commander had decided that killing 12-year-olds wasn't something he was willing to do, even if they'd just tried to kill him. Hans, Peter, and 6 other boys walked west for 3 days. They stayed off the main roads, moved at night when they could, hid from both German and Soviet patrols. They passed through Soviet lines on April 27th. The soldiers searched them for weapons, took their names, gave them water and stale bread, let them continue west. They passed through American lines on April 29th. The Americans put them in a displaced persons camp near Magdeburg. Hot food, medical care, real beds, Red Cross workers who tried to find their families. Peter's father found him on May 3rd. They cried together for an hour. Peter survived the war. He became a teacher in Munich. He wrote to Hans every year on April 24th until he died in 1998. Hans's mother found him on May 8, 1945. V-Day. She'd been living in the ruins of WWII, working as a nurse in a makeshift hospital. When she saw Hans, she didn't say anything. She just held him. Of the original 40 boys in Hans's Hitler Youth unit, 17 were killed in combat. 3 died from wounds or disease. 2 were captured by Soviets and died in POW camps. 1 survived Soviet captivity and returned to Berlin in 1947. Ernst Vogel. 17 survived, including Hans and Peter. Klaus Weber was buried in an unmarked grave. His parents never learned where. Conservative estimates suggest over 200,000 German children under 18 fought in the final months of World War II. Nobody knows exactly how many died. The records were destroyed, lost, or never made in the first place. Hans Müller lived until 2003. He was 70 years old when he died of heart failure in a hospital in Berlin-Wedding, 3 blocks from where he'd grown up. He never talked about the war. Not to his wife. Not to his 3 children. Not to anyone except Peter, and even then, only rarely. He worked for 42 years as a postal clerk. He lived in a small apartment. He collected stamps, like he had as a child. He was a quiet man who flinched at loud noises and never slept well. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, Hans walked to Skönhauser Allee. The school where they'd been based was gone, replaced by a modern building. The intersection where the tank had stopped was now a busy commercial area. Nobody remembered the battle. Nobody remembered the boys. He stood there for a long time. An old man on a busy street corner, looking for ghosts. In 2001, a filmmaker making a documentary about child soldiers in World War II tracked down Hans through Red Cross records. She asked if he'd be willing to be interviewed. He agreed to one interview. He told the story you just heard. The tank. The Soviet commander. The walk west. Then he asked that his full name not be used in the documentary. I wasn't a hero, he said. I was a scared child who fired a rocket at a tank and missed. The only reason I'm alive is because the man I tried to kill decided not to kill me back. That's not heroism. That's grace. The documentary aired on German television in 2002. The segment about Hans was 7 minutes long. 3 people who'd served in that same Hitler Youth unit contacted the filmmakers afterward. They'd all survived. None of them had spoken about it in 50+ years. Hans died 11 months later. The filmmakers tried to identify the Soviet tank commander who'd spare Hans. They never succeeded. Soviet military records from April 1945 were incomplete. Thousands of tank crews operated in the Berlin sector. Without a unit number or the commander's name, it was impossible to narrow down. Somewhere, possibly, there's a Russian man who made the decision not to kill a 12-year-old boy who just tried to kill him. Who looked at a child with a weapon and saw a victim instead of an enemy. Nobody knows his name. Nobody knows if he survived the war. Nobody knows if he ever told anyone about that moment on Skanhauser Allee when he decided that enough was enough. But somewhere in the arithmetic of war, his decision meant that Hans Müller got to grow up. Get married. Have children. Live a quiet ordinary life in a world that tried very hard to kill him when he was 12. This is what it means to send children to war. Not statistics. Not ideology. Not grand historical narratives. Just a 12-year-old boy named Hans Müller who was given a weapon he couldn't use against an enemy he didn't hate in a war he didn't understand. Over 200,000 German children fought in World War II's final months. Each one has a story like this. Most of those stories ended differently than Hans's. Most of those boys didn't meet a Soviet tank commander who decided not to fire. Remembering them isn't about politics or picking sides. It's about understanding what happens when adults fail children so completely that 12-year-olds end up holding anti-tank weapons in the ruins of their own cities. Hans Müller's war lasted 73 days. From March 3 to May 8, 1945. It marked him for the remaining 58 years of his life. He survived. He was one of the lucky ones. Remember that when we talk about child soldiers. Whether in 1945 Berlin or in modern conflicts. Every statistic was a child with a name. A family. A life they should have had. Hans Müller got to live his. Too many others didn't.